Okay, let's think about this. Imagine a situation where your identity marker, not your immediate medical need, could influence whether you get a life-saving drug.
Right.
Like, there was this doctor in New York City completely taken aback when a pharmacist actually asked about a patient's race before filling a Paxlovid prescription for COVID.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. Pretty shocking.
Or think about kindergarten kids. At the Gordon School in Rhode Island, they were apparently being routinely split into these mandatory race-based affinity groups.
Wow, kindergarten. That young.
Yeah. So what does it really mean when these identity labels, instead of, say, universal principles or just individual situations, start shaping things like access to medicine or, our very first experiences in school?
Well, these aren't just thought experiments, are they?
No, exactly. They're real examples, and they point to something pretty significant changing in how we think. And just so you know, you are experiencing a unique two-voice AI conversation. This is powered by Google's NotebookLM, and it's designed to help us get into a deeper, more dynamic analysis of complex books like the one we're discussing today. We're diving into a really thought-provoking book, The Identity Trap, a story of ideas and power in our time by Yascha Mounk.
It's a book that's generated a lot of discussion.
Definitely. And this isn't just, some dry academic debate. It's really about how these powerful ideas, often starting on university campuses, have quite dramatically reshaped things out here in the real world. Policy, everyday interactions, the works. So our mission today is to unpack the core ideas of what Mounk calls the identity synthesis. We want to explore how it rose so quickly, look at the real world effects, and then consider the alternative path the book lays out.
And this whole exploration is inspired by Mindful Moments, which is our YouTube channel.
Right, which offers AI book analysis specifically aimed at sparking reflection and hopefully rational thought.
So those opening examples you mentioned, the doctor, the kindergarten groups, they really capture the book's main point, don't they?
They do.
How this, quite theoretical framework, this identity synthesis, moved incredibly fast from niche academic debates right into shaping everyday life. Public health, education, you name it.
It's that speed, that velocity that really jumps out. So it makes you ask, okay, where did these ideas even start? How did they get going? Mounk traces it back to what he calls the intellectual roots, basically a rejection of the old grand narratives.
Exactly. And to get the bigger picture, the book suggests looking back, way back to, say, post-World War II terrorists, thinkers like Michel Foucault.
Okay.
Yeah. He was initially, influenced by early communist ideas, but then became deeply disillusioned by what actually happened in the Soviet Union. The brutality, the lack of freedom.
So that disillusionment was key.
Absolutely. It led him to shift focus dramatically. Instead of these big overarching stories about human progress, like Marxism's idea of an inevitable revolution, Foucault argued that power is much more slippery. It's everywhere.
Everywhere. How so?
Embedded in the identity labels we use, in the discourses, the ways we talk about things. He saw power as subtly controlling behavior through these things, not just through, the government telling you what to do.
Okay, that's interesting. So less about top-down state control.
Right. More about how language and categories shape us. And this led to a pretty deep skepticism about objective truth, about universal values, even about whether stable identity categories really exist.
So it's a shift from external control to something more internal, more pervasive, operating through how we think and talk. That's a fascinating way to look at how power works. How did that connect with post-colonial thought then?
Well, these ideas about power resonated strongly with leaders and thinkers from newly decolonized nations. Mounk talks about figures like Fanon or Gandhi, often educated in Western institutions. They were struggling, really struggling, to forge new identities for their countries. Because the old frameworks, liberalism, even Marxism, with their claims to be universal, had often been used to excuse or even justify colonialism.
So they needed something different.
Exactly. And that's where someone like Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak comes in. She introduced this idea of strategic essentialism.
Strategic essentialism, what does that mean?
Well, she basically acknowledged that, maybe defining woman in a fixed way is theoretically problematic. But she argued, you can strategically embrace such essentialist ideas for political power, specifically to fight back against oppression.
So you use the label, even if it's flawed, as a tool.
Kind of, yeah. Pick up a universal label that gives your group the leverage to fight back. It was a pragmatic political move born out of necessity.
I can see the logic there, especially in a fight for liberation. You rally around a shared identity. But it does sound like a potentially risky idea if that strategic element gets lost, right?
Definitely. It's a powerful tool, but maybe a double-edged sword.
So how did this kind of thinking, or maybe a similar feeling of disillusionment, lead towards critical race theory, CRT?
Mounk draws a clear line. He shows CRT emerging from a similar space of, well, deep disappointment, particularly through the work of Derek Bell,
Eric Bell, right, a key figure.
a very key figure.
Uh-huh.
Bell was profoundly disappointed with how things turned out after the main civil rights victories. He argued that supposedly race-neutral solutions, like desegregation, just weren't enough to tackle the deep, lasting legacy of slavery and discrimination.
He didn't think they went far enough.
Pretty much. He came up with this controversial idea he called the interest convergence dilemma.
Interest convergence, okay.
His argument was that real racial progress for Black Americans only ever happens when it also happens to benefit white interests.
That's a challenging perspective.
It is, and because of that skepticism, he started advocating for explicit group rights policies specifically designed to favor historically marginalized groups, rather than relying on universal approaches that he felt hadn't delivered.
So if race neutral wasn't enough, what about understanding how different kinds of injustice overlap? That brings us to Kimberly Crenshaw, doesn't it? And intersectionality.
Absolutely. Crenshaw's contribution was huge. She highlighted how different forms of oppression, racism, sexism, classism, they don't just exist side by side. They interact. They reinforce each other.
Okay.
The book uses a really powerful example, that General Motors lawsuit. Black women were falling through the cracks legally.
How so?
Well, the discrimination they faced wasn't quite the same as what white women faced, nor quite the same as what black men faced. So under existing legal frameworks focused on either race or gender, their specific experience wasn't fully recognized or protected.
So they were invisible in a way.
Exactly. Crenshaw pointed out, Black women are protected only to the extent that their experiences coincide with those of either white women or Black men. Where their experiences were unique, they had little protection. This insight, intersectionality, became a really powerful way to think about political activism, suggesting solidarity across different movements fighting different but connected oppressions.
Right, understanding those connections. Okay, so Mounk lays out these complex academic origins, but the next big question is how these ideas, Foucault, strategic essentialism, CRT, intersectionality, how did they make the leap from, dense academic papers into the mainstream, and so quickly, too?
That's really the core of the book's narrative, that rapid transition. Mounk points to several key factors, sort of accelerants.
Okay, like what?
First, there was a major geopolitical shift, the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s.
Right, the end of the Cold War.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That meant that class struggle, which had been the central organizing principle for much of the left, kind of faded. It created an ideological vacuum. And into that vacuum, slowly at first and much faster, flowed this new focus on culture and identity.
So economics and class took a backseat to culture and identity.
That's the argument. And this shift started reshaping intellectual life, particularly on campuses.
And then the internet happened. I assume social media played a massive role in spreading these ideas.
Oh, absolutely crucial. The book talks about platforms like Tumblr becoming breeding grounds. They took these complex, nuanced academic concepts and transformed them into, well, simplistic memes and slogans, as Mounk puts it.
Things like white privilege.
Exactly. White privilege, structural racism terms that were once pretty obscure suddenly went viral. The way social media works, rewarding content that appeals strongly to specific identity groups, really fueled this popularization. Mounk calls it the popularized form of the identity synthesis.
Content tailored for specific identity communities got amplified.
Precisely. And that online energy then spilled over into traditional media.
Makes sense. How did that happen?
Well, mainstream news outlets, even really prestigious ones like Vox or the New York Times, they started chasing clicks, chasing engagement. They figured out that first-person accounts, often focusing on identity and personal experience, were highly shareable, highly viral.
So the media model itself pushed these narratives forward.
The book argues yes. It mentions Vox specifically. Yeah. Founded with this idea of cool, dispassionate explainer journalism, it actually became a key vehicle for popularizing these concepts. Things like microaggression and white privilege quickly became standard journalistic language, shifting the whole public conversation.
Okay, so we've got academia, social media, mainstream media, but you mentioned a short march through institutions earlier. What does that refer to?
That's the next piece. Graduates who'd absorbed these ideas in college and online started getting jobs in influential institutions, nonprofits, foundations, corporations, government.
Bringing the ideas with them.
Exactly. Mounk argues this short march changed the norms, the rules, the sort of underlying assumptions within these places from the inside out.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Look at nonprofits. The ACLU is a classic case discussed in the book. Historically, they defended universal principles like free speech, famously even defending the rights of Nazis to march in Skokie.
Right, a very controversial stance based on principle.
Very. But Mounk describes a shift, with older staff becoming worried about younger hires who seem to prioritize identity-based concerns over those universal free speech principles. There was apparently real tension.
Interesting. Any others?
The Sierra Club is another example. Traditionally focused purely on environmentalism, it started taking stances on issues like defund the police or border policies, expanding its remit considerably based on these newer identity-focused frameworks.
And presumably this shift influenced where the money went to, foundations and grants.
Definitely. Big players like the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, Mounk says they faced internal pressure from staff. They started to explicitly favor, say, black or brown grantees, directing huge sums towards causes and groups aligned with this identity synthesis, sometimes quite radical ones.
So the funding landscape itself shifted to support these ideas.
It provided the financial engine, making them much more established and harder to challenge.
Okay, nonprofits, foundations, but corporations. That still seems a bit surprising. Aren't they usually more cautious?
You'd think so. But Mounk explains how diversity trainings evolved. What started as promoting mutual respect shifted towards teaching concepts like white fragility, essentially arguing that even well-intentioned white employees carry inherent biases, inherent racism or sexism.
Like that Coca-Cola training.
Exactly, that infamous example, telling employees to try to be less white, where less white was equated with being less oppressive, less arrogant, less certain, less defensive, less ignorant.
Wow. What drove corporations to adopt this?
According to the book, a mix of things. Pressure from employees, especially those from elite universities where these ideas were dominant, but also fierce competition for talent. Adopting these frameworks became seen as a way to attract and keep those highly sought-after graduates.
It sounds like a confluence of factors, intellectual shifts, technology, institutional changes. But Mounk adds another layer, political polarization, especially after Trump's election in 2016. How did that pour fuel on the fire?
Yeah, the book argues that Trump's election created this intense feeling of powerlessness among progressives. Their initial efforts, big protests, attempts to remove him, they didn't achieve the immediate goal.
Right.
So Mounk suggests many activists then turned that anger, that energy inward. They started policing their own side, targeting anyone in their immediate surroundings who had violated the new progressive sensibilities.
So the focus shifted from the external political opponent to internal conformity.
That's the dynamic Mounk describes. He asks, isn't it strange that the biggest enemy suddenly seems to be, the colleague down the hall with slightly the wrong opinion? This internal policing became really pronounced.
And that ties into basic group psychology, doesn't it? How groups behave under pressure.
It does. Mounk brings up Solomon Asch's famous experiments.
The line experiments.
That's the one. Where people were asked to compare line lengths, and most participants, like 3 out of 4, went along with the group's obviously wrong answer just to conform.
Peer pressure is powerful.
Incredibly. And when a group feels under threat, like perhaps many progressives felt after 2016, it becomes much less tolerant of internal dissent. Critics aren't seen as just disagreeing anymore. They might be seen as traitors, as morally suspect. So they get silenced, and the more extreme views within the group can take over. It helps explain how these norms got adopted and enforced so quickly.
Okay, so we've traced the ideas and their rapid spread. Now let's get into the practical consequences. What happens when these ideas are actually applied? Mounk details several areas where the identity synthesis is put into practice, often with problematic results, according to him. Let's start with identity-sensitive public policy.
Right. This is where we see a definite move away from race-neutral approaches towards explicitly race-conscious or identity-sensitive policies.
Why this shift?
The argument driving it is that it's the only way to achieve true racial equity and to properly address historical disadvantages that race-neutral policies might overlook or even worsen.
And the Paxlovid example fits here.
Exactly. The New York State Department of Health guideline allowing doctors to prioritize scarce treatments like Paxlovid for ethnic minorities, even if white patients had more traditional risk factors, is presented as a prime example.
What's Monk's critique of that approach?
He argues that policies like this risk actually entrenching the very divisions they aim to overcome. They can lead to resentment, potentially worse health outcomes overall if resources aren't allocated based purely on medical need, and they tend to be deeply unpopular across different demographic groups when people are actually pulled on them.
Okay, that's a serious concern. Another area that generates a lot of heat is cultural appropriation. It seems like accusations are everywhere now.
It's become incredibly widespread, yes. Mounk unpacks this phenomenon, giving examples ranging from musicians being criticized for adopting certain styles to chefs like Jamie Oliver or Gordon Ramsay getting called out for cooking dishes from other cultures like jollof rice or Chinese food.
Right.
There's even the story of a museum intern, Selena, asked to replicate a Chinese artist's self-portrait, which then led to debates. Or Bon Appetit magazine having to apologize because a Gentile writer shared a recipe for hamantashen, a traditional Jewish pastry.
It feels like the boundaries are constantly shifting. What's Monk's take on the concept itself?
He argues it's fundamentally flawed. First, it implies that cultures are collectively owned, like property, which he says doesn't make sense given how much cultures borrow and blend throughout history.
Like the examples of African prints having Indonesian origins.
Exactly. Kwame Anthony Appiah's point about West African Java prints actually coming from Javanese batiks sold by the Dutch, or kente cloth using imported silk. Cultures are dynamic, not static, isolated things.
So what's the real issue then, if not appropriation?
Mounk argues the concept misidentifies the actual wrong. The problem isn't borrowing itself, it's things like exploitation, not giving credit or compensation, mockery or disrespect. Focusing on appropriation shuts down potentially healthy cultural exchange and creativity, preventing us from learning from and enriching each other.
That makes sense, distinguishing between inspiration and exploitation. Now, another really charged area Monk tackles is free speech. He says a growing part of the left now sees free speech not as a universal good, but as a tool of oppression. Where does that idea come from?
It has roots in thinkers like Herbert Marcuse. He was a German Jewish philosopher who fled the Nazis, so he had direct experience of oppressive regimes.
Okay.
Marcuse argued that in a fundamentally unfree or unequal society, simply allowing everyone to speak doesn't lead to truth or liberation. Instead, he thought, it often just reinforces the existing power structures. Free speech becomes, in his words, an instrument for absolving servitude.
So free speech could actually protect the powerful.
That's the core of the argument. And this thinking fuels the shift from worrying about cancel culture to actually celebrating what some call consequence culture.
Consequence culture.
Yeah, the idea that it's good when private actors, social media companies, employers punish people for expressing unpopular views, even if those views are perfectly legal. Like that San Diego gas and electric worker fired over a hand gesture that was wrongly interpreted as a white power symbol. Proponents see this not as censorship, but as enforcing necessary social norms.
But Monk sees dangers in this, right? Limiting speech, even for supposedly good reasons.
He argues it's incredibly naive and dangerous. His core point is that censorship, no matter how well-intentioned, inevitably gets used by those in power to protect their own positions and suppress dissent.
So it always backfires.
Or at least it carries that huge risk. It also raises the stakes of political contests enormously. If losing an election means you might lose your right to speak freely, politics becomes much more brutal. And fundamentally, he argues, free speech is society's error correction mechanism. We need to be able to challenge ideas, even bad ones, to figure things out and make progress. Suppressing views hinders that vital process.
This connects to another trend Monk identifies, what he calls progressive separatism. Institutions actually encouraging division instead of integration. That seems like a major reversal.
It does seem to run counter to the goals of the civil rights movement, for example. Mounk gives concrete examples of those mandatory race-based affinity groups in kindergarten, universities setting up specific dorms just for students of color, separate graduation ceremonies based on identity.
Why is this happening?
The justification is often about creating safe spaces or allowing minority groups to connect and build solidarity away from the dominant culture.
But what's the downside, according to Monk?
He argues it directly contradicts principles of integration championed by figures like John Dewey or even Barack Obama, who stressed finding common ground. It also ignores social science, like Elliot Aronson's jigsaw classroom research, showing that cooperation across group lines is what builds empathy and reduces prejudice.
So it might actually hinder understanding.
That's the concern. Mounk also brings up the concept of racecraft, the idea that race isn't biological, but socially constructed.
Right.
If you accept that, he argues, the logical goal should be to transcend race, not to reify it by creating separate spaces, or worse, embracing ideas like being less white means being less oppressive, as seen in some trainings.
Okay, and finally, Mounk touches on critiques of meritocracy and the identity synthesis views on sex and gender. These are hot-button issues.
Definitely. On structural racism, Mounk acknowledges the reality of systemic injustices, like, say, schools in poor neighborhoods being chronically underfunded. That's real.
Right.
But he critiques the specific definition used by thinkers like Ibram X. Kendi, where any policy leading to unequal outcomes between racial groups is automatically labeled racist, regardless of intent. Mounk argues this can deny individual agency and lead to weird conclusions like a universal policy that helps everyone, but doesn't close a specific racial gap perfectly, could be called racist.
And on sex versus gender.
He credits feminism with introducing gender as a social construct to challenge limiting stereotypes. That was important. But he argues the identity synthesis sometimes goes too far, essentially denying the very concept of biological sex has any relevance, even in contexts like medicine or sports where it might. This can lead to claims that simply acknowledging biological sex is inherently transphobic.
A meritocracy. It gets a lot of criticism. What's Monk's defense?
He defends it, while fully admitting it's imperfect, and we always need to fight against bias in its application. But he argues it serves vital functions.
Such as?
It encourages people to develop skills. Society needs doctors, engineers, builders, artists. And importantly, it gives individuals a sense of accomplishment and purpose when they work hard and master something valuable. He suggests abandoning meritocracy altogether would harm both society's overall well-being and individual fulfillment.
So Mounk paints a picture of the identity synthesis as having significant downsides, as a kind of trap. What's the way out? He proposes philosophical liberalism as the alternative.
Yes, he presents it as a robust, principled alternative. Its core idea is really simple but profound, rejecting any notion of natural hierarchy and affirming that all humans are created equal.
That's the foundation.
That's the bedrock. And from that foundation, he builds out three fundamental principles for a just society.
Okay, what are they?
First is collective self-determination. Basically, power comes from the people. Systems like one person, one vote ensure governments are accountable and rulers can be removed peacefully. Amartya Sen, the Nobel economist, pointed out this even helps prevent massive abuses like famines because democratic leaders have to listen to their people.
Makes sense. What's the second?
Individual freedom. This means citizens have basic autonomy over their own lives, freedom of thought, conscience, religion, association. This is crucial for peace, especially in diverse societies, as it allows minorities to live according to their values without fear.
And the third principle?
Political equality. This means the government should treat everyone the same, granting all citizens the same rights and responsibilities regardless of their identity, race, religion, gender, whatever. It avoids privileging certain groups, which Mounk argues prevents destructive competition between groups and ensures everyone gets a fair shot.
Okay, so self-determination, individual freedom, political equality. These sound like classic liberal ideals. Does Mounk argue they actually work better in the real world?
Emphatically, yes. He marshals evidence suggesting that societies organized around these liberal principles tend to be, on average, richer, happier, score higher on human development indices, and are significantly better at avoiding large-scale cruelty and violence compared to societies based on other systems. He doesn't see this as accidental.
He sees it as a direct result of these principles in action.
Correct. Fostering open, accountable societies where individuals have rights and opportunities.
So how does this liberal framework offer a way forward, especially on issues of justice and inequality, that the identity synthesis also cares deeply about?
Monk's argument is that these universal values, equality, freedom, has historically been the most powerful engine for positive change. Think about the movements that overthrew slavery or segregation, or won rights for women or LGBTQ plus people. They appeal to these universal principles.
They use the language of universal rights.
Exactly. It provides a shared moral language that can appeal across group lines and stir the conscience, even of dominant groups. So the answer isn't to abandon these universal ideals because we haven't perfectly lived up to them. The answer, he says, is to double down, to strive more consistently, to make them a reality for everyone.
So the goal is fulfilling the promise of liberalism, not discarding it. How does Mounk suggest we actually push back against the identity trap in practice using this liberal framework? He seems to think it's already starting to happen.
He does see signs of a shift. Things like public backlash against perceived injustices, like unfair firings. Court decisions, sometimes rolling back policies based on these ideas, like certain mandatory trainings. And he talks about a reasonable majority.
A reasonable majority.
Yeah, a large group of people, diverse in background and political leaning, who he believes reject the extremes of both the far right and the identity synthesis. They want fairness, they want respect for minorities, but they don't buy into the core tenets of the identity trap as he defines it.
Okay, so there's potentially broad public support for an alternative. What about institutions? What practical steps can they take?
Mounk offers 3 concrete suggestions. First, cultivate tolerance. Institutions need to be explicit. Employees are expected to tolerate different viewpoints. Disagreement shouldn't mean punishment. Create that space.
Okay, tolerance first.
Second, protect free expression. He argues companies should be banned from firing people for political views they express privately as citizens unless their job is explicitly political. Protect people's right to speak their mind outside of work.
That's a strong stance. And third,
Regulate digital public utilities. This is interesting. Treat the big platforms, financial ones like MasterCard, social media like Twitter X, more like public utilities. Limit their power to deny service based simply on someone's views. Ensure access to the basic infrastructure of modern life and speech.
that's a framework for institutional change. What about individuals? If someone disagrees with the identity trap, how should they engage? How can they be effective?
Mounk puts a lot of emphasis on claiming the moral high ground. He advises critics to get over any sort of internalized shame or fear about voicing disagreement.
Don't be afraid to speak up.
Right. But also, don't just react with anger, becoming what he calls a defiant heretic. Instead, speak with calm confidence. Ground your arguments in reason in these noble liberal traditions. Trust that well-reasoned arguments based on universal values have power.
And how do you build a coalition for this alternative?
By persuading that reasonable majority. Recognize it's diverse. Mounk points out that many Asian Americans, Hispanics, and African Americans are actually less likely than some white progressives to fully embrace the identity synthesis framework. Reach out to them.
Find common ground across different groups.
Exactly. And also, make common cause with people from other traditions who also reject the identity synthesis, even if for different reasons. He mentions principled conservatives like David French or maybe some Marxist religious thinkers, anyone who sees the dangers in it from their own perspective. Build broad alliances based on shared opposition.
That makes strategic sense. Lastly, Mounk issues a warning. Avoid unhate-atheism. What's he getting at there?
It's the trap of simply defining yourself by what you're against. Just because proponents of the identity synthesis favor X doesn't mean you should automatically favor the opposite of X.
Do I just react?
Exactly. Avoid becoming so consumed with criticizing the other side that you forget to articulate your own positive vision for society. The goal isn't just to oppose the identity trap. It's to actively build something better, a society that truly lives up to those liberal ideals of freedom, equality, and shared humanity. Focus on the positive future you want to create.
Well, we have certainly covered a lot of ground today. We've journeyed from the complex intellectual origins of identity politics, traced its rapid rise, looked at its impact on our institutions and daily lives, and explored the alternative vision of philosophical liberalism presented in Yascha Mounk's The Identity Trap.
It's definitely a deep dive into ideas that are shaping so much of our current moment. And for more analyses like this, exploring books that really make you think, do check out Mindful Moments on our YouTube channel. We also have other podcasts digging into critical thought.
Mounk's book leaves us with a really fundamental question to ponder. In our incredibly diverse world, where does true solidarity lie? Is it found primarily in emphasizing what makes each group unique? Or is it found in rediscovering and recommitting to the universal values that perhaps bind us all together as individuals?
A crucial question for our times.
If this conversation has sparked your interest, definitely subscribe to our show for more explorations like this one. Please share this episode with friends or colleagues who enjoy thinking critically about big ideas. And if you want to dive deeper into Mounk's arguments yourself, you can find a link to purchase The Identity Trap in our show notes.
Your engagement really does help us keep these important conversations going.